Hi, friends. I'm Carrie Call. I'm the Transitional Conference Minister at Penn Central Conference, and I want to take a couple minutes to talk with you today about Sabbath keeping in a time of pandemic. There's been a lot of talk about Sabbath lately, even before COVID-19, and it was focused on self-care and care of the soul, and how it is that we carve out time for ourselves where we can contemplate God and be in a place where God is central. And in the time of pandemic, that's turning out to be really challenging for a lot of people. And I recognize that. So I want to think about ways that we might think about Sabbath keeping a little differently during this time. But let's start out with where it comes from and what it means. So we know historically some of the roots of Sabbath keeping. In the Christian church, it usually focused on two things. Religious observance of some kind, okay, and cessation from work. So observance and work are the two pieces that we have to pay attention to. The funny thing is that clergy are not very good at Sabbath keeping. We should be, right? We know what it means. We know how important it is for other people, but we're not so great at doing it for ourselves. And during a time of pandemic, it may become even more difficult for us to do. So it takes some thinking and some reflecting to think about how we're going to do this now. So the first piece to think about is, how was Sabbath or the Lord's Day celebrated when you were a child? If it was, and it may not have been. You may not have had anything like that in your childhood. Then again, you may have been part of a very strict expression of that time and have a sense of what it looked like then. That likely influences how you think about Sabbath now. And so what does that look like? What are the pieces of it that you need to be part of your own Sabbath? What is necessary for you in terms of religious observance? For some people, being part of worship, going into prayer, engaging in meditation are all necessary aspects of religious observance. For other people, religious observance might include contemplating the works of creation or studying the Word. There's different ways that we engage in religious observance. And during our time of COVID-19, that's definitely going to change and be impacted. And we need to be ready for that. The other piece, though, of Sabbath keeping is cessation from work. So we need to somehow become abstinent when it comes to work, at least for a little while. That's hard for clergy, not only because we have a strong sense of our value is tied up in what we're able to produce and do, but because we are usually helping personalities. So it's hard for us to stop doing the work that we feel that we've been called to do. However, God has commanded that we do just that we take a break from the work that we do. Now, one of the most important aspects of Sabbath is that what it looks like for me is going to be different than what it looks like for you. I have clergy say to me so often, my colleague Tom, on his Sabbath, he does contemplative prayer for 2 hours, and then he writes in a journal, and then he bakes things for people while praying for them. That's real Sabbath. I hear that. But that may be real Sabbath for him, but it doesn't mean that that's what's real Sabbath for you. And we have to be very careful because we tend to be very judgmental of ourselves about how good or not so good of Christians we are as clergy. And that certain things mean Sabbath and other things don't. So it makes sense. Take some time, think about this, what this means for you. What does it mean to practice religious observance for you, and what's necessary there? Then the other piece, though, is abstinence from work. And I know how difficult that is, but let's think about it for a minute. It might be that the one way that you connect with work the most is through your cell phone. And maybe it has to do with texting and emails and all of that. And in that case, your Sabbath keeping probably should include setting your phone aside, putting it on silent, turning off your email notifications for just that day. It may require that. But interestingly, the cell phone isn't always the main thing for people. Sometimes it's other props in our lives. Sometimes it's our desk, especially now that we're working at home, many of us are. We'll walk by the place where we have our workspace at home and we'll say, I'm just going to sit down here and do a couple of things, and then I will have the rest of my Sabbath time. Push the chair in. Don't sit down. Make an effort to keep away from the space where your work is. That is one of the most important pieces, is you've got to have a separation for your soul and for your brain. You've got to have a separation. And God has called you to do that, to separate from work. So what that's going to look like will differ from person to person. But now also during the coronavirus, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be different. So we have to think very carefully. How do we do our Sabbath keeping now? Now when we're perhaps at home with our entire family, how do we get our time or space alone? What if I'm alone and isolated? How do I do it then? What do I do? We have to be creative. We have to think in new ways, and we have to think in smaller chunks. You may not be able to take a full day Sabbath anymore, if you ever did, which would be wonderful if you did, but you may not be able to do that anymore. You may be able to take Sabbath moments, and those are important too. That can mean standing by the window and drinking a cup of coffee while you look outside. It can mean going outside and taking a walk around your house, or through a garden, or around the neighborhood, with or without your children, okay? It can show up in different ways. It might mean reading a poem, taking a break to make your mind work in a different way. So we have to think through that carefully. It may be moments instead of stretches of time. So what's that going to look like? Be creative with that. Think about trying something you haven't done before, possibly for Sabbath time, or something you haven't done in a long time. I know of colleagues now who are drawing, who haven't been drawing in a long time, or they are writing poetry, or they are taking an online class, or they're taking something in, they're reading a book on spirituality that they've been wanting to for a long time, and the delving into that allows them to have that Sabbath space and that time. What's important about Sabbath is that it's recognized as the time when we get out of the center of our lives, in a sense, and God is allowed to be in that center. Creative pursuits like drawing and making jewelry and things like that can do that. They can create that open space. So we have to be creative, we have to think in new ways, and we have to be patient. And we need to pray. And I say that not to be trivial, but to say that when things are taken away from us, like the way we normally spend our Sabbath, for example, there can be resentment and depression and anger. And we have to do some reframing about what Sabbath is going to look like. I encourage you to think through some of these things. I encourage you to write me, write Nora. Talk to us about what Sabbath means, the way that it's changed. We can put conversations together. We can lean on each other to be accountable and to help us care for our own spirits in this time. I pray that God's blessing be with you and that you are able to find your space for your own Sabbath keeping.